good morning, everybody. We're really excited to have Sarah Phillips here today. She is a linguistics PhD student at NYU, and as you will come to realize over the next 30 to 40 minutes, her research focuses on code switching and bilinguals and how we can model both monolingual and multilingual processing. And I think hopefully this will be a really great opportunity for us to hear about something that we all care about, but from hopefully a slightly different perspective. And we can have a nice discussion afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so very, very much. Again, my name is Sarah Phillips, and you wouldn't be able to tell from my name, but hopefully from my image on the website that I definitely a biracial, maybe even racially ambiguous person. But what I would like to make clear is that a lot of my research is really focused on the fact that I come from a bicultural, bilingual standpoint. So I grew up speaking Korean and African American English. You know, over time, I've had to learn the more mainstream variety through schooling. And I realized in my experiences in academia all throughout is that a lot of when we think of modeling behaviors and modeling things that have to do with people, we're really only focused on a very select population. And more often than not, it's this monolingual, English speaking or Indo-European speaking individual. And really, that stops short of what much of the world looks like. So for example, I just got back from Ghana. And if you were to ever go into Magla markets in Accra, which is the major city on the coast, you would find that walking into this market, people are negotiating and bartering in Ga, which is the local language for the local community that resides there, or the predominant local community that resides there. You'll hear Twi, which is a language of power from the Asante, since the Asante was a tribal tour de force, as you could, if you could imagine that in Ghana, but also English, both British English and Pidgin English. And these are remnants of colonialization that happened in Ghana. And so even in one marketplace, you can imagine hundreds, if not thousands of people interacting using any of these four languages quite intermittently. However, for me, I typically see code switching as an opportunity to not only, even though it involves switching languages during discourse, it's really fun to be able to think creatively with using these languages, not just in functions like bartering and negotiating, as I've described with what happened in Ghana, but even just in things like texting my mother, for example. So in anticipation of the Lunar New Year, I texted my mom this joke saying, 2021 is going to be so amazing. Now, so is written in Korean to signify the Korean so. So even though it sounds like the English intensifier, it actually denotes cow or ox. So how interesting that so, and 2021 is the year of the ox. You see where I'm going with this, hopefully. Now, unfortunately, my mom didn't get it at first. She responded saying, "Are you sure you mean so?" Like by saying "sohemada," like, "Are you sure you meant to use so?" But once I laid out the contrast, so amazing and so amazing, showing I was trying to be punny, she did eventually get it. But by this point, I'm exasperated. Like, it's no longer fun to try and do this whole joke when you have to explain your joke, right? But what you should be able to see is that code switching can be used not only in bartering situations, it can be used to be punny, it can be used in various ways in naturally occurring contexts where bilinguals will engage, right? So what I'm then interested in is how we're able to compose different words together. Now, this isn't specific to bilinguals, right? Monolinguals, bilinguals, it doesn't matter. If you are highly proficient in any language or languages, we all have this ability to compose words together into meaningful phrases. So for example, for an English speaker, it's nothing to be able to take icicles and melt, put them together and get this concept of icicles melting, right? But what is interesting is that bilinguals are able to not only compose words from a single language, but compose words from different languages. So for me, if I wanted to engage with my mother again, I could do something like "to melt," and she would understand that I'm using the Korean word for icicles, the English word for melt, and still get this concept of icicles melting. And while the bilingual speaker may have various reasons to code switch, as I've already kind of described in my beginning examples, the bilingual interlocutor is actually tasked with composing these words from different languages without much option or choice, right? You don't get an option as the receiving party, as the comprehender, to what languages your speaker is going to use. And so the bilingual interlocutor is then tasked with being able to compose these words from different languages together in order to understand the speaker. And what's interesting is that they're able to do so with almost seeming ease. So what I want to understand is then how bilinguals build and interpret these kinds of mixed language representations in the brain. Now, before I go into the nitty gritty, I do have to outline that I do work within a particular view of compositionality. So when I talk about composition, I'm really adopting a view from Hyman Kratzer, which asserts that meaning of a complex expression can be determined by the meaning of its parts and how such parts are hierarchically structured. So if we were to build hierarchical structures using syntactic information such as parts of speech, I'm sorry, not if, but we build these hierarchical structures based on the input that we received. So you'll hear me say red and then boat. And as you receive each word, you're going to associate that red as an adjective. Okay, I'm getting boat, which is a noun. That's to be expected. I'm going to put these two together and get this concept of a red boat. And because we've been able to build these structures, we're then able to interpret them semantically. So the fact that red and boat merge in the syntactic operation allows us to interpret red modifying boat. So that way we know that we have this concept of a boat that's been colored red or painted red. Now, this kind of idea of compositionality has been tested in various ways in our lab, or specifically my advisor's lab, Lena Pulkkinen. And so while it's nice that we've been able to investigate compositionality in a very detailed way, much of our understanding actually comes from a very monolingual perspective, and in particular from speakers of Indo-European languages. So studies that have investigated brain regions involving the composition of specifically two-word single language expressions implicate at least three regions of interest that I'll talk about a little bit today. The first one is this left anterior temporal lobe, which is indicated in green. Now, this region, not just in our lab, but in other studies using various techniques, have demonstrated how this region gets implicated for the conceptual combination involved in composition. That is, when we take two words and we combine them into a meaningful expression like red boat, the left anterior temporal lobe seems to be doing something with taking the concept linked to the form red and the concept of boat linked to the word boat, and then put them together in a way that you get this conceptual representation of a red boat. Then there's this left inferior frontal gyrus. If you've ever taken a neuroscience course or a neurobiology language course, and maybe even some linguistic courses, we'll talk about this. You've probably heard of Broca's area. While Broca is actually pretty problematic as an individual, his influence in thinking about this region being responsible for syntactic operations hasn't gone away. We call this the left inferior frontal gyrus because it's a more precise way of labeling the specific region, but it's still considered to be a hub for syntax, more specifically with recent work looking at syntactic merge maybe being hosted, or the mechanisms that are realized as syntactic merge hosted in this particular region. And then there's the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which is indicated here in purple. Now, it's not as clear about the VMPFC's role when it comes to composition, and yet it still manages to appear in various studies, especially studies coming out of our lab, that involve this computational compositional process. And this region seems to come active after the left anterior temporal lobe and the left inferior frontal gyrus are active in doing this kind of compositional process. Now, hopefully what you're seeing is not only that I've indicated these regions being particularly important when we think of composition, but you should also notice that these regions seem to be implicated using studies that not only use single language stimuli, but particularly languages that are more or less typologically similar. So even though Arabic, modern standard Arabic is known to be VSO word order, meaning verb, subject, object word order. Canonically, among spoken dialects, most Arabic speakers will actually revert to an SVO word order. American Sign Language, even though it does do a lot of topicalization and also a zero copula presence, so to say things like he handsome, he read, which you also hear in African American English, despite all that, when you have a canonical transitive sentence, you'll still get this SVO word order. German is historically a V2 language, but you will see subject, verb, object word orderings as well. And of course, English is very strict in this SVO word order. So I wanted to note that because it might become relevant again later on. But again, it's important to note that this model, while it's been heavily studied, we're still limited in thinking about this from a monolingual Indo-European perspective. Now, what I want to then do is say, okay, when we take a model like this, does this model readily apply for a bilingual who's composing not only words from a single language that they know, but also words across different languages that they know? And there are two hypotheses that I've developed from the literature. The first one would be that really it's a shared system. So the same mechanisms housed in these same regions would still operate whether or not you're composing words from two different languages or two words from the same language. However, there has been quite a bit of research interested in code switching specifically in psycholinguistics and neurolinguistics that would actually argue that you might actually need additional brain regions in order to manage these kinds of language switches. And so what I want to show is that the basis of this complex system hypothesis actually comes from studies interested in how bilinguals can switch languages during production. And what these studies suggest is that bilinguals have a language control mechanism which allows them to switch between languages. Oh, sorry. That was supposed to come up, but in essence, my bullet point is just to, again, further iterate what I just said, which is that these studies are supposed to provide support for a language control mechanism. Now, the earliest study that I know of to explicitly investigate code switching behavior as it might relate to other types of cognitive tasks is from Meter and Alport in a study that they published in 1999. Now, their study actually had different bilinguals. So you could be German English, you could be French English, you can be all these different types of bilinguals. And what you would do is you come in and you would learn to associate specific languages with specific color cues. So here, if I were to participate in the study, maybe I would be trained to associate blue with English and red with Korean, for example. Then after I've been told or trained to associate these color cues with a specific language, then I would be asked to name a presented numeral using the language color cued by the color. So let's say in this first trial, I would do 7, 3, and here we have a no switch trial, right? So I've been presented with 2 successive numerals and they've both been cued by the same language, and in this instance, English. But I could also get a trial like this, 7, 10. So in essence, I need to then switch languages to be able to name 3. So I'm using English to name 7 and then Korean to name 3. And this would be an example of a switch trial. What they then did was analyze how long it took from you from the presentation of the number to how long it took you to actually produce the name for that numeral, right? And what they found was that bilinguals were by and large slower when they had to switch languages in between these in between these trials than when you didn't have to switch language in these no switch trials. This kind of task, which I will refer to as an object naming task, has been used as well in neuroimaging. So Garbin et al. In 2000 published a paper in 2011, which used a similar object naming task as the Meter and Alport study that I just showed you, but they recorded their participants doing the test using fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. Now, what's great about this technique is you can get very precise with the spatial localization of the activity of brain regions as they're engaged in things, but you don't necessarily get the timing of things. So here we're only going to get really good spatial information. Now, it might be really hard to see these little red dots, but the idea is that these red dots represent areas of the brain where their participants exhibited increased activity for when they had to switch languages between trials versus when they didn't have to switch languages between trials. One of these regions I've already actually mentioned to you before. It's the left inferior frontal gyrus. Now, what's interesting is that, again, the LIFG is supposed to be responsible for this syntactic operation merge kind of thing, right? So it's interesting that in an object naming task where you're not composing words together, that this region seems to be active doing language switching tasks. Now, the other region, which is really, really hard to see on the screen probably, so I've blown it up for you here, is the anterior cingulate cortex. Now, the anterior cingulate cortex isn't actually heavily studied when it comes to language processing mechanisms. It's actually more widely studied for its role in decision-making and emotion regulating behaviors. But this region also seems to be active when we do these kinds of language switching tasks. So again, studies like the two that I've just described to you seem to support this need for a language control mechanism. Production latencies and this activation of prefrontal brain regions seem to suggest that these bilinguals have a language control mechanism housed in these prefrontal regions. So that would be regions like the LIFG and the anterior cingulate cortex. However, naturally occurring switches actually didn't elicit effects in these regions at all. So I know I didn't discuss it in much detail. If you would like, I can discuss it later. But a former co-lab mate who's now currently a postdoc at Harvard, SC Glorieta, did a study with Lena, my advisor as well, on what happens when you present bilinguals with naturally occurring code switches in comparison to doing a similar object naming type task. And what they found in that study that was published in 2017 was that anterior cingulate cortex does not care. Another region also implicated for language switching, which is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I won't talk about it much today, didn't show effects either when bilinguals are just passively listening to a story where there's code switching involved. Despite the fact that there's now some evidence to suggest that maybe language control is not used in all instances, there have been several models proposing a language tagging system which allows us bilinguals to have language control mechanisms, if that makes any sense. So these are three different models that are actually focused on different types of bilingual behavior. Myers-Scotton's matrix language frame model is really a way to try and capture how code switching is very systematic and in some ways seems to be rule governed. And in her model, she proposes that you had to have language membership such that the matrix language would know where to pull morphemes, in particular grammatical morphemes, into a syntactic derivation that can be sent into for interpretation. Whereas Green's inhibitory control model was actually really interested in more of what we saw with these studies. What is this language control mechanism doing that could be potentially housed in the prefrontal regions? And so in essence, he proposes this supervisory attentional system. Then what it attends to is actually when something is tagged with one language or another. And the reason for this is that when things are entered into a derivation, this supervisory attentional system will say things like, okay, if I'm in an English mode, I can only pull items that are tagged English, if that makes any sense. And Dijkstra and Van Hoeven's BIA plus model actually complements very well with Green's inhibitory control model by placing in their schema a language node that is responsible for managing these language tags, and it's situated between form and meaning. So phonological and orthographic representations, and as well as the conceptual meanings. There's now a third node for language, which would then negotiate language membership, if that makes any sense. So to return back to my two hypotheses, the first hypothesis is pretty simple. It's kind of like, oh, well, what monolinguals do, bilinguals also do. But in a more complex system, the idea is like, okay, sure, you can still have these compositional regions engage to do this kind of compositional behavior. But having additional brain regions are going to be necessary to manage language switches when you're composing between two languages. And that's because in any of these models that have language control implemented, at least during comprehension, a plausible consequence is that when a bilingual receives input, it'll be biased towards receiving successive words in the same language. So if I get icicles, I'm going to be biased towards wanting the next word to be the same from the same language, right? I'm going to want a verb that is, for example, melt, right? However, when you receive a successive word from a different language, that would come as a surprise, requiring the system to then activate a different language tag to be able to access and compose the two words that come from different languages and be able to put them together to get something meaningful. And then what do you do when you want to build off of that? That's also not as clear if you were to implicate language control during comprehension. So to test these two hypotheses, while also trying to be mindful that we need more typologically distinct languages represented in our field, I recorded and analyzed the activity of both composition and language control regions among Korean English bilinguals as they compose two-word expressions. I guess it's pretty easy and convenient for me that I also get to work with a population that I'm familiar with as also a Korean English bilingual. Now, to prevent word order differences from becoming a confound, I did use nouns and intransitive verbs that form simple two-word sentences for our compositional stimuli. So I use things like icicles melt, for example. Now, this is because English is SVO, but Korean is SOV word order. And when you have an intransitive verb, then you're going to be biased towards having this subject verb kind of closer relationship in comparison to, let's say, a SOV word order. Okay. And then to see whether or not we get a compositional effect, we also needed to compare activity generated from two word verb lists that do not readily compose. So I would present our participants with non-compositional list stimuli like jump and melt. Hopefully hearing jump melt doesn't readily compose for you, because I know it doesn't for me. I can't think of an instance where I would be jumping to make something melt. But that's the idea. The idea is that if we were to see a compositional effect in any of the brain regions I mentioned before, then we should see increased activity from those regions for things like icicles melt than for things like jump melt. And then what I was also able to do, because this first study did everything using visual presentation, we were then also able to manipulate the language of each word to test for language switching effects. So here we have icicles noga and the standard script for Korean, which is hanga. But then we were also able to use the Roman alphabet just to see if there may have been potential effects of switching orthographies that are not necessarily contingent on language, right? So I was able to manipulate that specifically for Korean lexical items, because Korean English bilinguals, as well as Korean speakers in Korea, are also familiar with a romanization system that's been set forth by the South Korean government. And my study involves South Korean or people from South Korea. I don't think it's quite easy to get North Korean defectors who also know English to readily participate in studies, unfortunately. Okay, so to record participants' brain activity, what we used is magnetoencephalography, or MEG for short. It's quite a tongue twister. Unlike fMRI that I showed you a little bit earlier, which gives you great spatial information, MEG gives you less accurate spatial information, good enough to know where things are, especially compared to EEG if you're familiar with other neuroimaging techniques. But what's important is that this machine is sensitive enough to pick up the electrical current emitted from populations of neurons when those neurons are engaged for a task. So in essence, we can see when activity fluctuates in specific brain regions with millisecond accuracy. And this is important when we think about how language unfolds in time. I know I'm probably talking really fast, and so you can imagine that your brains are going a million miles per hour, being able to process each word that I put forth and being able to compose those words together to hopefully get some sort of a message from my talk so far today. Now, For this study, what we did was we presented 2 words serially, followed by a picture in each trial. For compositional stimuli, participants were asked to indicate whether the picture that ended each trial matched the 2-word sentence. So if you get icicles melt, the idea is, does the picture match the phrase icicles melt? And for the list stimuli, participants were asked to indicate whether the picture at the end matched one of the 2 verbs. So if you get jump, melt, the idea is, does the picture match either jump or melt? And so to give you an example, I'll present an example trial for each stimulus type. So the first one will be what participants saw for the compositional stimuli. Okay, and here, hopefully you would indicate, yes, the picture matches the 2-word expression. And then now what you'll see is an example trial when we use the list or non-compositional stimuli. Okay, and hopefully here you also would indicate yes, because hopefully the picture still matches the idea or concept of melting, even though it's more specific that icicles are doing the melting. Okay, so to be able to measure for these effects, we time locked our analyses based off the presentation of the second word. So it's always going to be a verb. And for my examples, it's always been melt. And 20 Korean English bilinguals participated in our study. So 20 people came into the lab, did the recording while being presented with a bunch of trials like the ones you just saw. I think 720 to be exact. Luckily, these were all early acquirers of Korean and English who also self-rated themselves as being highly proficient in being able to read Korean and English, and also being highly familiar with the words that were used in the study after they had completed the study. Okay, so if I haven't lost you so far, in essence, I'm looking at what their brains are doing in composition regions and language control regions as they compose words from a single language together, as well as words from different languages together, and see if we get effects of composition, language switching, and or orthography switching in these regions. Now, when we subjected the MEG recordings to a 2x2x2 ANOVA to capture this potential interaction, or at least main effects of each of these, we found that in the compositional regions, out of the compositional regions, the left anterior temporal lobe, specifically the left anterior temporal pole, which is situated in the anterior temporal lobe, showed an effect of composing words together, peaking at about 165 milliseconds after onset of the second word. So in our other studies, it's usually somewhere between 175 and 225 milliseconds after onset of the second word. So even though they're a little early, they're right on the money in being able to exhibit this composition effect. Now, what's interesting is that this composition effect does not interact with language and or orthography switching. So at least at some conceptual level, this anterior temporal lobe, which we think houses this process of being able to conceptually combine using linguistic information, doesn't care about language membership, right? So whether the words come from Korean, English, whatever script it comes in, doesn't really matter. The bilingual brain is readily able to compose them together. When it came to language control regions to see if maybe we would see a language switching and or orthography switching effect, we actually didn't see effects of these during the same time window where we would expect composition. Yes, Johan, hopefully I said your name right.
Yes, sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask a question already, but I'm too stupid to understand these graphs. So I'm looking at at 2 different lines and at some times, and then something that seems to be, remarkable at the time, but I don't understand really what's going on here.
Okay. Well, hopefully I didn't lose you up to this point, did I? Because if not, then I'll just...
I don't think so. No,
okay. No worries. Then let me go and explain these graphs a little more in depth. Hopefully you can see my cursor here.
Yep.
Okay. So here, what we're looking at here in this top half are 2 regions that I had mentioned before as being related to composition, right? The left temporal pole is housed within the left anterior temporal lobe, and the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is that purple region also that was associated in that earlier graph. What you're looking here in these graphs themselves is the average activation over the time course that they're presented with the first word from negative 600 milliseconds to 0 milliseconds. And then the second word from 0 milliseconds to 600 milliseconds. So in essence, at negative 600 milliseconds, they're getting something like icicles or jump. And at 0 milliseconds, they're getting something like melt. Okay. And then what I'm comparing is what happens when you get activity, when you get icicles melt, which is the blue line, and jump melt, which would be the yellow line. The area of interest is going to be this second time window, right? So from 0 to 600 milliseconds is where we're presenting the second word, which would be melt, based off of my example. And what you see here indicated by this purple arrow is a significant difference of activity when you're presented with melt after you receive icicles versus when you get melt after you've been presented with jump. And this difference being significant is what we would call a composition effect, meaning the fact that we get a combinatory stimulus that elicits this activity versus getting a non-combinatory stimulus that elicits this activity. Hopefully that makes sense.
Totally, yes. Now I understand. Thank
okay,
you.
Perfect.
Thank
you.
you.
No worries. Sorry, I have a tendency to move really fast, so I appreciate you stopping me and getting me to slow down. So what's important is, again, here in the left temporal pole, we see that this effect that we would anticipate for monolinguals also appears in bilinguals. We don't see this in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is not too surprising for me, considering the VMPFC is still kind of this mysterious thing when it comes to combinatory processing. But what is interesting is that these language control regions, which have been implicated for language switching, which people have argued that maybe language control would be housed, at least some mechanisms housed within language control would be in these specific regions, don't activate during the same time that we get combinatory processing. So if we think that the brain is sensitive to be able to compose a second word to a first word around 200 milliseconds, it's surprising that we don't see an effect of language switching if language switching matters during this stage in regions responsible for language switching or language control. Does that make sense?
Totally, but could I ask an add-on question? Because what I don't understand now is the first significant band, because that's happening with the first word already. Why is there a difference?
Yeah, so I have some ideas about what that activity might be in the first time window for the first word. It could be that what we're seeing is actually a difference in the lexical category of the word. It could be an anticipatory effect. So you're anticipating that you're going to compose because you know you're getting a noun and you want to be able to predict the next word. And so you're anticipating something that would readily compose. And from the psycholinguistic literature, we know that people engage in this kind of anticipatory predictive processing type of behavior. So there's some possibilities as what those significant effects are in the first time window, but I don't have any further analyses to really have an idea as to what I think may be happening there, especially because I'm not necessarily looking to analyze those first words. Sorry if that's not a satisfying answer.
No, it just lets me think about what notion of significance we really have, no? Because that could happen in the second window as well then, no? I mean, it could have other reasons, I mean, than...
Of course, but based off of a large body of literature, at least when it comes to composition, the reason why we're going to be more confident about this being a composition effect in the second time window is for the fact that we not only see this in very different types of stimuli, so even more complex stimuli, we see this with other different types of pairings. So the original study that was done with English words actually used adjective noun pairs versus noun verbs that I used in this study. We have actually a bigger body of literature to support the idea that this is really compositional effect in the second window, whereas it hasn't been as robustly investigated what those effects in the first time window would be. So it's less clear to me what that would be. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on. But if this still perplexes you, we can talk about this afterwards, because I have done some thinking about this, but not as much as maybe I should. Okay. Now, I mentioned that I didn't see language or orthography switching effects during this composition time window that we normally see effects in composition regions, but it doesn't mean that we didn't see any effects of switching at all. Actually, what we did see is effects of switching in our regions, or at least this interaction between language and orthography switching in both composition and language control regions. Now, what I will point out is that for the left inferior frontal gyrus, which is implicated in both composition and in language switching, as well as the anterior cingulate cortex, both of these regions exhibit at least some significant difference in the second time window when they've been presented with a second word where it's plausible to have this kind of switch occur. And these effects are trending, right? So after controlling for multiple comparisons, the p-values on these were, I think, 0.06. So trending, but not quite significant. Whereas in our composition regions, we're actually getting significant effects. So after controlled for multiple comparisons, these were about p-values of 0.05 or just under that, right? So it's interesting not only that we're getting this interaction between language and orthography switching, but the reason the bar graphs are here is to show you the pattern that's happening on the second word. So if you notice that for each graph for the second word, where you would get a plausible, it would be plausible to interpret these results as having to do with an interaction with language and orthography switching, is that there is this correspondence between script and language. So in essence, whenever the language doesn't script, the orthography doesn't switch as well, or when the language does switch and orthography also switches, we're seeing either more positive or negative activity in comparison to when only orthography switches or only language switch. So it would be, in essence, at least for me intuitively, it is kind of strange when I'm going to switch languages, but I don't switch orthographies. But even more so if I switch orthographies, but I'm not switching languages. Like writing English in both, or writing Korean in both Roman alphabet and Hangul in one sitting is kind of strange if you think about it that way. So it's interesting that we're getting this kind of correspondence effect in all four of these regions. Okay, so I know that's a lot of brain stuff. So I put together a little intro summary of things so far, which is first is to show that current psychoneurolinguistic models of language processing are heavily biased towards monolingual Indo-European perspectives. And I'm not sure if this is also true in NLP, but it wouldn't be surprising if this is true, considering the preponderance of studies that have been done, especially on English, but even in neurolinguistics, there's a large preponderance of German, Dutch, and even Finnish because of sites where those studies are being conducted, right? So in the US, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, they have access to the resources. And so they're going to test in those population groups. Now, what studies that have been interested in code switching phenomena in particular have developed models that focus on the lexicon. So this would be your storehouse of your lexical items that you know as a competent speaker here. And they posit that you would have to have language tagging in order for bilinguals to then exert language control. But these studies, again, focus more so on production and comprehension, even though I do present a plausible consequence of having language control implemented during comprehension as it relates to composition. And what the results of my study find is that language control seems to not be involved during composition. We don't see language switching or orthography switching effects during the actual processing stage of composition, as we observed in the left anterior temporal lobe specifically. And what's actually surprising is that this correspondence between language and script seemed to be very important for processing, although that seemed to start after the composition process had already started. So the earliest effect was actually in the left inferior frontal gyrus, starting at about 169 milliseconds, but peaking closer to that 200 millisecond time window, whereas our effect for composition in the left anterior temporal lobe was peaking at about 165 milliseconds. So it was a little bit earlier than this effect from the association between language and script. So this has left me with this interesting question of like, what does this association between language and script signify for the bilingual? And this is something I have been thinking about because I do want to write another paper based off of this data, since it's pretty interesting that this correspondence came through. And at least from a preliminary standpoint, looking at visual cortices and regions of the brain that attend to recognizing word forms, they don't actually seem to respond to language switching. And instead, the robustness of this correspondence effect is really in this left inferior frontal gyrus, and then working its way through other parts of the brain at later stages. Now, after doing all this thinking about this relationship, I'm talking with one of my peers, one of my cohort mates, Alex Forstadt, who's also a computational linguist. And when I asked him, I was like, what would computationalists be interested in with my research? Like, what would be cool? And he pointed me to this paper, which was actually very interesting. It was quite surprising that computational linguists have already been thinking about how to model multilingual phenomenon using a BERT model. And so this MBERT model basically introduces over 100, I think it was 104 single language corpora using Wikipedia pages, if I'm not mistaken. And I did read the paper because, like neuroscience papers, computational papers are quite short, which is lovely. But I'm also not a computational linguist, so I might have missed a few key points. But there are a few key things that I did grasp from this paper. The first thing is that MBERT was actually really good at transfer between languages that are typologically similar. So if you train MBERT using English, and then you want it to transfer to do a task, let's say in maybe Spanish or German, it was actually very good at being able to do that. However, when languages were typologically dissimilar, so I believe in this paper, they did an English-Japanese pairing, the transfer actually wasn't as good. We're going from something like English to Japanese. And given that Japanese and Korean are much more typologically similar than different, to me, that screams, oh my goodness, like, what is it about typologically dissimilar languages when, at least in my work, it doesn't seem to affect bilinguals much at all to be able to engage in certain tasks like translation? I would imagine it could be a transfer task for something like MBERT. Then I learned that MBERT exhibits comparable performance when trained on either monolingual corpora or code switching corpora, as long as those corpora use the standard scripts for that language. So it was actually really good at being able to transfer, let's say, from like English to Hindi, as long as Hindi was in the Devanagari script, which I find very, very fascinating. So you don't get a lexical overlap or this form overlap between the languages. And yet MBERT was still able to do this kind of transfer pretty well. And not only do that transfer with monolingual, so being trained on English and Hindi data, but also using code switching corpora. So taking something like English Hindi code switching and be able to train from that, it was still pretty successful at transfer, which is very interesting. And then finally, when they did try to do a transfer using a transliterated target, so when Hindi, for example, was written in the Roman alphabet rather than in the Devanagari script, MBERT actually didn't perform well at transfer at all. And so again, here we see this uncanny thing about script and language having this kind of connection and being able to engage in any type of language-based task. And so taken together, as far as I understand, this model that does not pre-tag for language, pre-tag for parts of speech or any other grammatical information at training is still okay at generalizing for typologically similar languages. And it begs the question then, what things or what information would be important, let's say for a computational model to be able to use for training, or for a bilingual individual or just any individual when they're learning their first language or languages, what things they might need in their disposal, or what things they might need in terms of information to be able to then develop their languages and be able to transfer between their languages or be able to use both languages interchangeably. So what does this mean for modeling how bilinguals are able to build complex expressions using elements from different languages? At the level of composition, switching it up ain't got much switching at all. It seems like at this level of being able to compose words together, the brain doesn't have to do this kind of switching work, like I'm switching from doing one thing to another. And by contrast, it seems like the brain is able to just work effortlessly as if this is more of a cooperative task. And so it can just readily compose these lexical items together without much additional effort. However, correspondence between language and script seemed to matter for literate bilinguals. And this was also true in what we saw with Mbert. And so maybe computational models can give us some ideas, or me ideas, about what role script plays in these later stages of processing. What is this relationship between language and script signifying, and how that might be important during language processing? Okay, so special thanks to my advisor, Lena Polkinen, because she's, you know, she signs off on everything. She helped me design the study in a way that made the most sense, as well as fellow members in our NEL lab group. We definitely collaborate and work off each other, so they helped me not to sound stupid and things like this. And the work that I present today was funded by NYU Abu Dhabi grant G1001. And if you would like some references, here are some of the ones that I referenced earlier. Thank you so very much.